The bell above the door of Nana's table hadn't even finished ringing when the man in the gray suit slammed a manila folder down on the counter, hard enough to rattle the pastry case. "Everyone out," he announced to the line of customers, loud enough for the whole shop to hear. "This bakery belongs to my client now. The girl behind the counter doesn't own anything here anymore." Rosalind Marchetti froze, with a tray of cornetti still in her hands, flour dust drifting from her apron, as every head in the shop turned toward her. "Excuse me?" she said, setting the tray down before her hands could start shaking in front of an audience. "Foreclosure," the man said, flipping open the folder and spinning it toward her like he was dealing a losing hand of cards. 30 days. Your landlord sold the building out from under you, sweetheart. Whatever you think you own, you don't." Mrs. Alvarez, 3 customers back in line, gasped audibly. Someone near the window murmured something about the Mafia girl finally getting what was coming to her, a whisper Rosie had heard before, and hated more each time. She felt her face go hot, felt every eye in the bakery cataloging her humiliation, like it was the morning's entertainment. And she hated, more than the notice itself, that she couldn't find a single word to defend herself with. "This building has been in my family for 60 years, she managed finally, voice tighter than she wanted it to be. "You don't get to walk in here and—" "I get to do exactly what I want," the man said, smiling with teeth too white to be trusted. "Sign here, and maybe my client lets you keep your equipment when we clear the place out." That was the exact moment the bell rang again, and Dante Castellano walked into her bakery for the second time that day, at 9 o'clock at night, when the sign clearly said, "Closed," and there was no earthly reason for him to be there at all, except that he was. She'd learned his rhythm without meaning to. Same booth by the window every morning for 4 months, same black coffee, same slice of ricotta pie, never more than 11 words to her in a single sitting. She'd counted. She wasn't proud of that, but she'd never once, in all that time, imagined the quiet, unsmiling man in the corner booth had a reason to walk through her door, twice in the same day, uninvited, at an hour when the shop should have been empty. The man in the gray suit's confidence drained out of him, like water from a cracked glass, the instant he turned and saw who was standing in the doorway. "Mr. Castellano," he said, and his voice cracked on the second syllable. "You're in the wrong shop," Dante said. His tone hadn't changed at all from the flat, quiet voice he used every morning to order his coffee, but something in the room shifted anyway, some invisible weight settling over every person present, except Rosie, who was only beginning to understand exactly who had been sitting in her window booth for 4 months. "My client purchased this building legally," the man said, though his hands were already closing the folder. "There's nothing. Your client is Vincent Losco," Dante said, "and Vincent Losco doesn't purchase anything without my knowledge. Leave the paperwork. Leave the deed. All of it. The building isn't for sale anymore." The man set the folder down without another word, gathered his coat, and left through the front door so quickly he nearly forgot to duck under the bell. The silence after the door shut was so total that Rosie could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the eyes of every remaining customer still fixed on her, waiting to see what happened next. "You should sit down," Dante said, and for the first time since she'd met him, there was something almost gentle underneath the command in his voice. "You're shaking." "Who are you?" she whispered, though she already suspected the answer, the same answer whispered in every corner store and back alley of this neighborhood, the answer she'd refused to let herself believe about the quiet man who liked her ricotta pie. He didn't answer directly. He reached into his coat, took out a card with no name on it, only a phone number, and set it on the counter beside her register. "Someone will come collect the real deed paperwork tomorrow. Don't sign anything else without calling that number first." "That doesn't answer my question." A faint, humorless smile crossed his mouth. "No," he agreed, "it doesn't." He left without another word, and the remaining customers slowly filtered out behind him, murmuring, casting glances back at Rosie that had shifted from pity to something closer to fear. She locked the door, flipped the sign, and stood alone in her grandmother's kitchen, holding a business card with no name, staring through the office doorway at the one thing she hadn't let herself think about all evening, the locked wooden box her grandmother had made her swear, on her deathbed, never to open unless her life depended on it. Rosie had laughed at the time. It had sounded like the fevered instructions of a dying woman clinging to old country superstition. Standing here now, with a stranger's threat still hanging in the air and a Mafia boss's phone number on her counter, she wasn't laughing anymore, and she found herself wondering, for the first time, exactly what her grandmother, Concetta, had spent 60 years so afraid of, and what a man like Vincent Lasco believed was worth threatening a bakery over. Rosie didn't sleep that night. She sat at her grandmother's old kitchen table, with the wooden box in front of her, running her fingers over the brass lock she had no key for, listening to the traffic outside on Taylor Street, the way she used to listen to Conchetta's stories about the old country, half believing them, half certain they were just bedtime tales, meant to make a little girl feel like her family had once mattered somewhere far away. By morning, she had convinced herself that whatever secrets the box held could stay buried a little longer. What couldn't wait was the bakery. The oven still needed to be fired at 5. The bread still needed proofing. And if she wanted Nana's table to survive past the 30 days on that notice, pretending everything was normal was the only thing keeping her hands steady. Dante didn't come in that morning, or the next. 3 days passed with an empty booth by the window, and Rosie hated how often her eyes drifted toward it, hated the strange hollow feeling that settled into her chest every time the bell rang and it wasn't him. On the 4th day, a woman walked in, wearing a coat that cost more than Rosie's monthly rent, heels clicking against the tile like a countdown. She introduced herself as Camille Rossi, and she didn't bother pretending to want coffee. "I hear Dante Castellano paid your debts," Camille said, sliding onto a stool at the counter, examining her manicure rather than looking at Rosie. "That's not like him. He doesn't do favors." "I don't know anything about debts," Rosie said carefully, wiping down the counter with more force than necessary. Camille's smile was thin, practiced, the kind Rosie imagined she used to charm men out of their better judgment. "You will. Dante doesn't do anything without a reason. I've known him 12 years. We're engaged, in case he forgot to mention that particular detail." Rosie's hand stilled on the counter. She hadn't asked, hadn't wanted to know, and yet something in her chest twisted at the words anyway, sharp and unwelcome. "Congratulations," Rosie said flatly. "Stay out of his business," Camille said, standing, smoothing her coat. "Whatever your grandmother left behind, whatever he thinks he's protecting, it isn't worth what happens to people who get in the way." She left a 20 on the counter for a coffee she never ordered, and walked out without looking back. Rosie stood there a long moment, replaying the warning, wondering exactly how many people already knew about the box before she did. Dante returned the following morning like nothing had happened. Same booth, same order, newspaper folded neatly beside his coffee cup. Rosie set his plate down harder than necessary. "Your fiancé stopped by," she said. Something flickered behind his eyes, gone before she could name it. "She's not my fiancé." She seemed pretty convinced. "Camille's father and mine arranged something 20 years ago that neither of us asked for," Dante said, and there was an edge in his voice now, controlled but unmistakably there. "It's a business matter, nothing more." "Funny how everyone in this neighborhood keeps telling me things are business matters," Rosie said, "right before someone threatens to burn my life down." Dante looked up at her then, really looked, in a way that made her suddenly aware of the flour on her apron, the tired circles she was sure were under her eyes, the fact that she probably looked nothing like the women who usually earned this man's attention. "Sit down," he said, nodding to the empty side of the booth. "I have a business to run." "Sit down, Rosie." It wasn't a request, but it also wasn't unkind, and against every instinct telling her to keep her distance from whatever world this man belonged to, she sat. "Your grandmother worked for my family," Dante said quietly, low enough that no one else in the bakery could hear, "before I was born. She was a cook for my grandfather, back in Palermo, before everyone came to Chicago. Something happened. She left in the middle of the night and never came back, and my grandfather spent the rest of his life furious about it." Rosie's mouth went dry. "She never told me any of this." "She wouldn't have," Dante said. "Whatever she took with her, whatever's in that box in your office, it's the reason Vincent Losco is circling your building, and it's the reason I'm sitting in this booth every morning, instead of somewhere I actually need to be. So you're not here for the pie." The corner of his mouth moved, almost a smile, gone as quickly as it appeared. "The pie's good. That's not why I'm here." "Then why are you here?" He didn't answer right away. He studied her the way she imagined he studied every threat and opportunity in his world, weighing, calculating, deciding how much truth a person could handle. "Because whatever's in that box could destroy my family, or save it, and I intend to find out which, before Vincent does. And if I don't want to give it to you either." Something almost like respect crossed his face. "Then you're braver than most people who've sat across from me." That night, after closing, Rosie finally worked up the courage to force the lock on the wooden box, using a screwdriver and more determination than skill. Inside, beneath a layer of yellowed lace, she found a leather-bound ledger filled with her grandmother's handwriting. Dates going back decades, names she didn't recognize, and numbers that looked less like recipe measurements and more like transactions. She was still turning the brittle pages, trying to make sense of the entries, when she heard tires slow outside on the wet street, then stop directly in front of the bakery. The car outside didn't move. Rosie stood frozen at the office doorway, ledger still open in her hands, listening to the engine idle in the rain, and it was only when a car door opened and closed, followed by familiar footsteps crossing the sidewalk, that she let herself breathe again. The bell above the front door rang. She hadn't locked it. She'd been too absorbed in the ledger to remember. "You shouldn't be here alone at this hour," Dante said, stepping inside, rain soaking through his coat, his eyes moving immediately to the leather-bound book in her hands. "One of my men called, said a car had been circling the block twice in the last hour." "Vincent's people?" "Probably." He crossed the kitchen toward her, close enough that she caught the smell of rain and cold air on his coat. "What is that?" She hesitated, some instinct telling her that whatever was recorded in those pages was the same thing that had made her grandmother spend 6 decades in fear, the same thing that had brought Vincent Losco's men into her bakery, with threats dressed up as offers. But she'd also just spent an hour alone with a stranger's car idling outside her door, and something in her couldn't carry this weight by herself any longer. "My grandmother's ledger," she said, sliding it across the table. "It was locked in that box. There are dates, names, numbers that don't look like recipes." Dante's eyes moved across the pages with the focus of a man reading his own history for the first time, and slowly, his expression shifted from confusion to something guarded, careful. "These are payments," he said, "to my grandfather, from a man named Bianchi, every month for 3 years, right up until the year my father died. You think that's connected?" "I don't know what it means yet," Dante said, and there was an honesty in the admission that surprised her, coming from a man who seemed to weigh every word before he spoke it. "Bianchi was my grandfather's second in command. He inherited half the organization after my father died, then sold his share to Vincent Losco's father before he disappeared. Payments stopping the same year my father was killed could mean 100 things. I'm not going to guess my way into believing something I can't prove. But you want to prove it." I want to understand why your grandmother spent 60 years hiding a book of numbers, he said quietly. That's a start. It was near the back of the ledger, tucked into the binding, that Rosie found the photograph, and she went still the moment she saw it. A young woman, who was unmistakably Concetta, standing beside a man whose face she didn't recognize, both of them smiling, in a way that looked, even in a faded photograph, unmistakably happy. Dante took it from her carefully, studying it for a long moment. I don't know him, he admitted. He's not in any of the family photographs I grew up with. Whoever he was, somebody made sure he wasn't remembered. Rosie turned the photograph over. Written in her grandmother's careful hand were 6 words that made the kitchen suddenly feel colder than the rain outside. He must never know the truth. Know what truth? Dante said, and for the first time since she'd met him, there was something in his voice that wasn't controlled at all, something closer to fear. I don't know, Rosie admitted, but I don't think it's a coincidence that Vincent wants this book badly enough to threaten a stranger over it. My grandfather never spoke about the years before he came to Chicago, Dante said, turning the photograph over in his hands, like it might yield more if he looked long enough. Not once. My father used to say it was because the old country had taken more from him than it had ever given, but I always assumed that meant money, or standing, not a person, not someone he clearly cared enough about to keep a photograph of, however he came to lose her. Maybe he didn't lose her, Rosie said slowly. Maybe she left, the same way my grandmother did, at the exact same time. Maybe they're connected, because they ran from the same thing. Something in Dante's expression sharpened at that, a theory forming behind his eyes that he didn't say aloud, not yet. Neither of them heard the second car pull up outside, not until the beam of a flashlight swept briefly across the front window and vanished. Dante was on his feet instantly, pulling Rosie back from the glass, his hand closing around hers without either of them thinking twice about it. Someone's been watching this building longer than I realized, he said quietly. How long? Long enough that I should have had someone here from the first night Vincent walked through that door. His jaw tightened, some private frustration passing behind his eyes. I'm going to have men outside starting tonight. You won't see them, but they'll be there. And if I say I don't want to be watched, then you're safer than you'd be otherwise, whether you want it or not, he said, and there was something almost gentle beneath the stubbornness of it. Your grandmother kept this secret for 60 years, Rosie. Whoever wants it badly enough to threaten you isn't going away because we ask nicely. She looked down at the photograph, still resting between them on the table, at the young, hopeful face of a woman she'd thought she'd known completely, and felt the ground of her own history shift slightly beneath her feet. Whatever truth her grandmother had spent a lifetime protecting, it was clear now that it belonged to both of them, tangled together in ways neither Rosie nor the quiet, careful man, standing across her kitchen, fully understood yet. The bell above the door had rung twice already that morning, before the boy walked in, maybe 25. Expensive watch, the kind of easy smile that came from never once being told no. He was the son of the family, who owned the shoe repair shop 2 doors down, and he'd been finding excuses to linger at Rosie's counter for weeks. You always work this hard, or is it just for me? He asked, leaning against the register, while Rosie wiped down the espresso machine. I work this hard because the ovens don't run themselves, she said, but she was smiling despite herself, and she didn't notice Dante's newspaper had gone still in his booth until she carried a plate of cornetti past him on her way to the boy's table. You should let me take you to dinner sometime, the boy said, reaching out to touch her wrist as she set the plate down. Rosie doesn't have time for dinner, Dante said, and his voice hadn't risen at all, hadn't changed from the flat, quiet register he used for everything, but something in it made the boy's hand withdraw immediately, made him glance toward the window booth, like he was only now noticing who occupied it. Didn't realize she was taken, the boy said, forcing a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. She isn't, Rosie said pointedly, shooting Dante a look he ignored entirely, returning his attention to his newspaper as though he hadn't just ended a conversation that had nothing to do with him. The boy left without finishing his coffee, and Rosie rounded on Dante's booth the second the bell stopped ringing behind him. You don't get to do that. Do what? Decide who I have time for. You've barely said 200 words to me in 4 months, and suddenly you're running off customers. Something flickered behind his eyes, gone before she could name it, replaced by the careful blankness he wore for the rest of the world. He wasn't a customer. He was wasting your time during your busiest hour. That's not what that was, and you know it. He didn't answer, and his silence, sharp and deliberate, told her more than any admission could have. She left him there with his coffee going cold, and didn't speak to him again for the rest of the morning, though she caught him watching her twice, both times looking away a beat too slowly to pretend he hadn't been. It was later that same week, after the bakery had closed, and a sudden downpour had trapped them both under the awning outside while she locked up, that she saw something in him she hadn't expected. My mother used to bake, he said, apropos of nothing, watching the rain pool in the gutter. Before my father died. After, she never touched an oven again. I don't think she could stand doing something that reminded her of when we were still a family. What was she like? Soft, Dante said, and the word seemed to cost him something to say out loud. Gentle in a way nobody in my world is allowed to be. My grandfather used to say she made me weak. I spent 20 years trying to prove him wrong. He looked at her, and there was something raw in his eyes she hadn't seen before, something that made her chest tighten. I'm not sure I ever succeeded. I don't think caring about people makes you weak, Rosie said quietly. I think it makes you the only person in this whole mess who hasn't tried to threaten me yet. A ghost of a smile crossed his mouth. Give it time. You won't, she said, surprising herself with how certain she sounded. I don't know how I know that, but I do. Neither of them moved for a long moment, rain drumming against the awning, and the space between them felt smaller than it had any right to, smaller than 4 months of 11-word mornings should have allowed. She thought, briefly, that he might actually close the distance, and some reckless part of her wanted him to. The moment shattered when a car door slammed across the street, and Camille Rossi came striding toward them, heels sharp against the wet pavement, expensive umbrella doing nothing to soften the fury on her face. Well, Camille said, stopping just short of the awning, eyes moving between them with an assessment so blatant it made Rosie's skin crawl. Isn't this cozy? Camille! Dante's voice had already gone flat again, the warmth of a moment ago sealed shut like a door closing. I heard you scared off some poor shoe repair boy today, Camille said, ignoring him entirely, focusing her attention on Rosie instead. Careful. Dante doesn't chase off competition unless he thinks he already owns something. Doesn't mean he'll admit it, though. Men like him don't fall for women who smell like flour and work double shifts to pay rent. They fall for women who understand their world. He's just killing time until he remembers that. That's enough, Dante said, and the temperature under the awning seemed to drop several degrees. Is it not true? Camille's smile was sharp enough to cut. Ask him what I am to him, Rosie. Go on. See if he actually answers. Rosie turned to Dante, some foolish hope in her chest, despite everything Camille had just said, waiting for him to correct the record, to say something, anything, that proved the last few minutes under this awning had meant what she thought they had. It's complicated, Dante said finally, and the words landed harder than any insult Camille could have delivered herself. Right, Rosie said quietly, stepping back from beneath the awning into the rain, rather than stand there a second longer. Thanks for clearing that up. She walked the rest of the way home, soaked to the skin, furious at herself for how much his silence had cost her, furious at Camille for being right about the one thing that mattered most. And she didn't see, as she turned the corner onto her own street, the way Dante stood motionless under that awning, long after both women had gone, staring at the space where Rosie had been standing, like a man who'd just made a mistake he didn't yet know how to undo. 3 days passed without Dante setting foot in the bakery, and Rosie told herself the silence didn't hurt as much as it did. She threw herself into work instead, testing recipes, restocking the pantry, trying not to notice how often her eyes drifted to the empty booth by the window. It was the 4th morning when everything fell apart. 2 Chicago police detectives walked into Nana's table at 7 a.m., badges out, faces grim, and asked Rosie to come down to the station. She thought at first it was about the foreclosure paperwork. It wasn't until she was sitting across a metal table in an interrogation room that she understood the truth. "We have a witness statement," Detective Ruiz said, sliding a photograph across the table, "placing you at a warehouse on Halsted Street 2 nights ago. Same night, an associate of Vincent Losco's turned up dead." Rosie stared at the photograph. Grainy, clearly taken from a distance, but the woman in the frame wore Rosie's coat, had Rosie's build, stood in front of a building Rosie had never once visited. "That's not me," she said. "I was at the bakery until midnight. My part-timer Angela can confirm." Angela already gave a statement, the second detective said, not unkindly, but with the flat certainty of someone reciting a script. "She says you left around 10. Rosie's stomach dropped. Angela wouldn't lie. Unless she'd been told something, paid something, threatened with something. "Someone's setting me up." "That's what everyone says," Ruiz replied. Across the city, in an office with the blinds drawn, Tony set the same photograph in front of Dante and watched his boss go still. "Camille brought it herself," Tony said. "Says it's a courtesy, warning us before it goes public. Or she's making sure I see it exactly the way she wants me to," Dante said, though he was already scanning the image, the coat, the build, the angle that made the face impossible to confirm. Every instinct trained into him since childhood told him evidence didn't lie. That sentiment was the weakness his grandfather had always warned would get a man killed. He thought of Rosie's hand under the awning 3 nights ago, and made himself set it aside, like something too hot to hold. "Get her a check. Tell her it's best we keep our distance." "You sure about that?" Tony asked, and it wasn't really a question. "I'm not sure of anything," Dante said, which is exactly the problem. They held Rosie 6 hours before releasing her without charges, but the damage had already spread through the neighborhood like a grease fire. By the time she walked back to Taylor Street, half her regulars stood outside gossiping instead of eating breakfast, and fragments followed her through her own door like ghosts. Mafia girl, Castellano's girl, always knew there was something off about that family. Worse than the whispers was the silence from Dante. If he'd heard, and surely he had, he made no move to help her. No call, no visit, nothing. She found out why that evening, when one of his men appeared at her back door with an envelope. "Mr. Castellano asked me to give you this," he said, not meeting her eyes. Inside was a check, more money than the bakery's yearly revenue, and a single typed note. "This should cover your legal fees. I think it's best we keep our distance from each other going forward, for both our sakes." No signature, just money, like she was a problem to be paid off, exactly the way Camille had promised she would be. Rosie tore the check in half in front of the stranger, and closed the door without a word. She didn't cry that night. She was too angry. She sat with the ledger Dante had never returned, and the same stubborn fire that had made Conchetta cross an ocean and build a business from nothing, hardened into resolve. If Dante wanted distance, he could have it. She wasn't going to beg a man to believe her innocence, wasn't going to chase someone who'd decided, without asking her a single question, that a photograph and a coerced statement were worth more than 4 months of mornings, and one rain-soaked evening that had felt like the start of something real. She spent the next week rebuilding her reputation alone, calling every regular who'd stopped coming in, refusing to grovel. She filed a formal complaint, hired a lawyer with money she didn't have, and quietly began asking her own questions, which led her, 3 days later, to Angela's younger brother, a busboy at a restaurant Vincent frequented. Angela didn't want to say anything, the boy admitted, twisting his apron. But Lasco's men came to our apartment, said if she didn't say you left the bakery that night, they'd make sure our mom lost her hospital job. She didn't have a choice. Rosie's hands went cold. Do you have anything that proves that? He pulled out his phone, playing a voicemail he'd secretly recorded, one of Lasco's men laying out threats against Angela's family, in a voice unmistakably tied to the men who'd stood in Rosie's bakery weeks earlier. It wasn't enough to clear her name in court, but it was enough to prove she'd been framed, and enough, holding that phone in her trembling hands, to make Rosie realize the truth was bigger and more dangerous than a single false statement. Vincent hadn't just wanted the ledger. He wanted her gone, discredited, isolated from the one man capable of protecting her, and she understood now, with sudden clarity, that Dante's silence, his check, his cold note, hadn't been abandonment at all. It had been exactly what someone wanted him to do. Dante Castellano hadn't slept in 4 days. He told himself it was business, the usual chaos of running an organization that stretched across half the city, but the truth sat heavier in his chest than any deal or debt ever had. He'd sent that note to Rosie because Camille had shown him security footage. Grainy, but damning. And because every instinct trained into him since childhood said cut the loose thread before it unravels the whole operation. He hated himself more with every hour that passed. It was Tony, his oldest and most trusted man, who finally brought him the truth, sliding a phone across his desk with a recording already cued. You need to hear this, Tony said, before you do anything else stupid. The voicemail played, Lasco's man's voice unmistakable, laying out threats against Angela's family, with the same casual cruelty Dante recognized from a lifetime around men, exactly like him. When it finished, Dante sat in silence for a long moment, hands flat on his desk, jaw working. Where did you get this? Rosie's been doing her own digging, Tony said. Talked to the busboy herself. Found the connection to Lasco's crew inside a week, working alone, with half the neighborhood turned against her, and no help from us. There was something almost like admiration in Tony's voice, and it only made the guilt in Dante's chest burn hotter. She's not stupid, boss, and she's not who Camille made her out to be. Camille, Dante repeated, the name suddenly tasting like poison. Get me everything on her financials. Every phone call, every meeting, going back 6 months. It took less than 2 hours to confirm what some part of him had refused to believe. Camille's accounts showed 3 separate transfers from a shell company, traced directly back to Vincent Lasco. Phone records showed calls between the two of them going back nearly a year, long before the fake engagement had ever resurfaced as a topic between their families. Camille wasn't just aware of Lasco's plan. She'd helped design it. Dante was reaching for his coat, already calling for Tony to bring the car around, when his phone rang. Unknown number. He almost let it go to voicemail. Something made him answer. Mr. Castellano. A voice he didn't recognize. Calm, almost bored. We have Miss Marchetti. If you want her back in one piece, you'll bring the ledger to the old Fulton Market meatpacking building by midnight, alone, and you'll tell your men to stand down. The line went dead before Dante could respond, and the phone slipped an inch in his grip before he caught it, his knuckles white against the glass of his desk. For a moment, he simply stood there, the office silent around him, and Tony would later say, it was the only time in 15 years he'd seen Dante Castellano's hands actually shake. Boss, Tony started. Get every man we have to Fulton Market, Dante said, voice low and controlled in a way that frightened Tony more than shouting would have. Quietly, I don't care what it costs. I don't care what rules we break. If anything happens to her, he stopped himself, because he didn't have words for what came after that sentence. Had never once in his adult life allowed himself to consider losing something he couldn't afford to lose, and the terror of it was unlike anything he'd felt since he was 9 years old, standing over his father's casket. I built this whole life on the idea that nothing could touch me if I never let anyone close enough to matter. I let her matter. Tony, God help me, I let her matter, and now she's paying for it. 3 hours earlier, Rosie had been walking home from the lawyer's office, replaying the recording on her phone, trying to decide who to trust with it, when a van pulled up beside her on a side street she thought was empty. She fought. She'd give herself that much credit later. Kicked one man hard enough to drop him, screamed loud enough that a window opened 2 floors up before a hand clamped over her mouth, and the world went dark around the edges from the chemical rag pressed against her face. She woke tied to a chair in a cold, cavernous room that smelled like rust and old meat, wrists bound behind her back, head throbbing. Vincent Losco sat across from her, calm, almost pleasant, like they were sharing coffee instead of a hostage situation. "You should have taken the money and disappeared," he said. "Simpler for everyone." "You framed me for murder," Rosie said, voice raw but steady, refusing to give him the satisfaction of hearing her afraid. "Threatened a teenage boy's family, bribed my own employee, and you're lecturing me about simple." Vincent's smile thinned. "Your grandmother's ledger proves my father paid for a murder. If that gets out, everything he built, everything I inherited, collapses overnight. I can't allow that, Miss Marchetti. Nothing personal." "It's very personal to me," Rosie said, "considering I'm tied to a chair." He laughed, short and humorless, and checked his watch. "Castellano will be here soon. He'll bring the ledger, because men like him always convince themselves they can win. Then I'll have both problems solved at once." Rosie's mind raced, even as her pulse hammered in her ears. She thought of her grandmother, crossing an ocean with nothing but a locked box and a secret, surviving decades of silence, rather than letting fear dictate her choices. She thought of Dante's voice under the awning, complicated, and how furious she'd been at the word, and how she'd give anything right now just to hear him say something clearer. She worked quietly at the ropes binding her wrists while Vincent paced, checking his phone, growing visibly more agitated as midnight approached. And just as she felt the first give in the knot, the heavy metal door at the far end of the warehouse groaned open, and Dante Castellano stepped into the dim light, alone, exactly as instructed, ledger in one hand, and an expression on his face that Rosie had never seen before, something cold and absolutely lethal, aimed entirely at the man who dared to put his hands on her. "Let her go," Dante said, voice flat and terrifyingly calm, "and we can discuss the ledger like reasonable men." Vincent smiled, though sweat had broken out along his hairline, despite the cold of the warehouse. "You always were sentimental, Castellano. Your father had the same weakness, cared too much about the wrong people." Something shifted in Dante's expression at the mention of his father, a flicker of grief buried under decades of practiced control. "You know something about my father's death." "I know everything about your father's death," Vincent said, and there was a terrible pride in his voice now, the confidence of a man who believed he held every card. "My father didn't just pay Bianchi to look the other way. He ordered it." Salvatore Castellano was getting soft, talking about pulling out of the family business, taking his wife and son somewhere clean. "My father couldn't allow that kind of instability, so he had Bianchi arrange the accident, and Concetta Marchetti saw the whole thing happen from the kitchen window of the villa. That's why she ran. That's why she spent 60 years terrified someone would find that ledger and put the pieces together." The room went utterly silent. Rosie, still working the ropes loose behind her back, watched Dante absorb the confirmation of everything he'd feared, watched his hands tighten around the leather cover of the ledger until his knuckles went white. 27 years of grief crystallized in his face into something colder, harder, aimed entirely at the man standing across from him. "You're telling me this because you think it changes something," Dante said quietly. "I'm telling you this because in about 90 seconds, none of it will matter," Vincent said, and he raised a hand, signaling toward the shadows at the edge of the warehouse, where the shapes of his men shifted into view along the loading dock. But the 90 seconds never came the way Vincent intended. The far door blew open before his men could move, and Dante's people flooded in from both entrances at once. More of them than Vincent had accounted for. More than anyone should have been able to gather on an hour's notice. Vincent's men, badly outnumbered, dropped their weapons almost as fast as they'd raised them, and Vincent himself, calculating the odds with the same cold precision he'd used his whole life, bolted for a side exit, rather than stay and watch his plan collapse around him. "Let him go," Dante said sharply, when Tony moved to give chase. "Rosie first. Always Rosie first." He crossed the warehouse in 3 long strides and knelt beside her chair, fingers working quickly at the remaining rope around her wrists, his eyes never leaving her face. "I'm sorry," he said, low enough that only she could hear. "For the note. For the money. For every second I let you believe I'd chosen anyone else's word over yours. I was wrong, and it nearly cost you everything." "You're a little late with that apology," Rosie said, voice shaking but sharp, rubbing feeling back into her freed wrists. "Considering I was tied to a chair in an abandoned meatpacking plant." "I know." His hands cupped her face, gentle, despite the violence still simmering in the room behind them. "I know, and I don't expect you to forgive it easily. But I need you to know none of it was ever really about the ledger. Not for a long time." "Then what was it about?" she asked quietly. And for a moment he looked like a man deciding whether he was brave enough to answer honestly in the middle of a warehouse still full of armed men. "You," he said simply. "It was always you. From the first morning you set that ricotta pie in front of me, like you weren't afraid of my name at all." She let herself lean into him for one brief moment, exhaustion finally catching up with the adrenaline that had carried her through the last several hours. And for that moment, neither of them spoke, the warehouse around them full of the low murmur of Dante's men securing the scene, disarming the last of Vincent's stragglers. It was one of Dante's own men, an older man Rosie didn't recognize, gray at the temples, dressed plainly compared to the others, who helped her to her feet and steadied her when her legs nearly gave out from hours of sitting bound in the cold. He looked at her a beat too long, something unreadable crossing his weathered face, an expression closer to grief than concern. "You have her eyes," he said quietly, almost to himself, so softly she nearly missed it. "Conchetta's eyes." "You knew my grandmother?" Rosie asked, startled, turning to face him fully. But the man had already stepped back, murmuring something to Tony about securing the perimeter, careful not to meet her gaze again. In the chaos of the warehouse, the fear still draining out of her limbs, Rosie let the strange comment slip past her, too exhausted to chase it, though it settled somewhere in the back of her mind, like a splinter she'd have to dig out later, one more loose thread in a night already full of them. Vincent Lasco's escape meant the danger wasn't over, not fully, and Dante knew it, even as he wrapped his coat around Rosie's shoulders and led her toward the door, one hand steady at the small of her back the entire way. Somewhere out in the dark, a man with nothing left to lose was already planning his next move, and somewhere closer than either of them realized, a truth neither had asked for yet was waiting to surface, carried by an old man with familiar eyes who'd called her by her grandmother's name, like he'd been waiting 60 years for the chance to say it aloud. The old man's words followed Dante out of the warehouse and refused to let him sleep. "You have her eyes. Conchetta's eyes. No one on his payroll called Rosie's grandmother by name unprompted. Not casually, not with that particular ache in his voice. And by morning, Dante had pulled every man who'd responded to his call the night before into his office, one at a time, demanding to know who the gray-haired stranger was. None of them knew him. He'd simply appeared among the reinforcements, moved like he belonged there, and vanished before anyone thought to stop him. "That's not possible," Tony said, running the security footage from the warehouse back frame by frame, pausing on a blurred figure near the loading dock. "Nobody gets past our people without a name and a reason. Somebody let him in." "Pull his face," Dante said. "Run it against everything we have. Old family files, everything from before I was born if you have to." It took 6 hours, and a records clerk willing to dig through boxes nobody had opened in decades. But the match came back just past noon, and when Tony laid the old photograph beside a still frame from the warehouse footage, Dante felt something cold settle into his chest that had nothing to do with the December weather outside his window. The eyes were the same. The set of the jaw, aged by nearly 3 decades, but unmistakable all the same. The name attached to the old photograph had been struck from every family record Dante had ever been shown. Erased so thoroughly, he'd never once heard it spoken aloud in his own household. Not by his mother, not by his grandfather, not by a single member of the organization who might have remembered. "That's impossible," Dante said quietly, staring at his own father's face grown old, staring back at him from a photograph that should not have existed. "He's dead. I watched them bury him. I was 9 years old." "You watched them bury a casket," Tony said carefully, choosing each word like it might detonate. "Boss, I don't know what this means yet, but somebody's been erased from every piece of paper this family kept for 27 years, and last night, he walked into a warehouse to help save the girl you're in love with. That's not a coincidence. That's a man protecting his own." Dante didn't have an answer for that, and the not knowing sat in him like a wound he couldn't press hard enough to numb. He was still staring at the 2 photographs, side by side, 27 years apart, when his phone rang with a call that shattered whatever fragile calm he'd managed to hold on to. It was Rosie's number, but not Rosie's voice. "Should have taken the money," Renzo Lasco said, and disappeared. "Everyone in my family keeps having to teach that lesson twice." 2 hours earlier, Rosie had been closing the bakery alone, exhausted, still shaken from the night before, when a note appeared under the front door, unsigned, threatening, warning that Vincent's cousin intended to finish what Vincent hadn't. She'd called Dante immediately, hands shaking as she read it aloud, and he'd been 5 minutes out when Renzo, already inside the building through the forced back door, took the phone from her hand mid-call and ended the conversation with a threat instead of a goodbye. "Should have taken the money," Renzo said again, this time directly to Rosie, gun drawn, desperation written across every line of his face. His cousin's empire had collapsed overnight, his family's name dragged through headlines, and he had nothing left to protect and nothing left to lose, which made him, in some ways, more dangerous than Vincent had ever been. "You took my family's future. I'll take something from yours. Everyone in your family says the exact same thing," Rosie said, and to her own surprise, her voice came out steadier than she felt, right before it stops working out for them. She threw the only thing within reach, a heavy marble rolling pin, catching Renzo hard across the temple, buying herself just enough time to scramble behind the industrial mixer as the gun went off, the bullet burying itself in the wall, inches from where she'd been standing seconds earlier. She grabbed the fire extinguisher mounted by the ovens and swung it as Renzo rounded the mixer, catching him across the jaw, sending him sprawling into the prep table hard enough to crack the wood, but not before his hand closed around her wrist and dragged her down with him, the two of them grappling across the flour-dusted floor as the gun skidded out of reach into the shadows beneath the ovens. Dante burst through the front door 40 seconds later, weapon drawn, to a scene that stopped his heart cold. Renzo Losco pinning Rosie beneath him, one hand raised, and Rosie, blood at her temple from where she'd struck the corner of the prep table, not moving fast enough to get free. "Get off her," Dante said, and the sound that came out of him was nothing like the flat, controlled voice he used for everything else in his life. It was raw, animal, the voice of a man who had just spent the entire day discovering his father might still be alive, only to arrive and believe, for one unbearable second, that he was about to lose the one person who had ever made that possibility feel like it mattered at all. Renzo froze at the sight of the gun leveled at his head, hands rising slowly, and in the sudden, ringing silence of the wrecked kitchen, Rosie lay still on the flour-dusted floor, eyes closed, and for 3 of the longest seconds of Dante Castellano's life, she didn't move at all. Rosie, Dante was on his knees beside her, before Renzo had even finished raising his hands, gun still trained on the man, but his focus entirely on the still figure on the floor. "Rosie, look at me." Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused for a terrible half-second, before finding his face. "I'm fine," she managed, wincing as she touched the cut at her temple. "Hit my head on the table. I'm fine, Dante." The breath he let out sounded like it had been trapped in his chest for hours, maybe for the entire day, ever since a stranger's photograph had cracked open, 27 years of buried grief, before he'd even had time to process it. Tony's men, arriving seconds behind him, had Renzo zip-tied and on his knees within moments, and it was Dante himself, voice still rough with the fear he hadn't fully shed, who made the call to the police this time, instead of handling it his family's old way. "Turn him over with everything," Dante said. The recording of the threats against Angela's family, the financial records connecting the Loscos to Camille, let the truth bury him instead of a bullet. It was 3 days later, once Rosie's stitches had healed enough that she'd stopped flinching when she touched them, that Vincent Losco made his final, desperate move. He'd been hiding in a cousin's house in Cicero, and when word reached him that Renzo's arrest had opened the door to every file the police needed to finish him for good, he did the only thing he had left. He walked into the reopened dining room of Nonna's table, in broad daylight, gun tucked beneath his jacket, and demanded the ledger in front of a room full of witnesses, as though sheer desperation might still turn the tide in his favor. "You've lost, Vincent," Dante said, stepping between him and Rosie without hesitation, voice carrying easily across the suddenly silent room. "Every man who used to work for you has already turned. There's nothing left to threaten me with." "There's always something," Vincent said, hand moving toward his jacket, and that was the moment the door behind him opened, and a gray-haired man in a plain wool coat stepped calmly into the bakery, flanked by 2 men Dante recognized now, with sick clarity, from the warehouse 3 nights before, the same 2 men who'd guarded the stranger who'd called Rosie by her grandmother's name. "Put it away, Vincent," the old man said, his voice carrying an authority that made even Vincent's hand still. "You're outnumbered, and you've always known when to fold." Vincent's face went the color of ash. "That's impossible. You're dead." Everyone said what your father wanted said," Salvatore Castellano replied, and Dante felt the ground tilt beneath him at the sound of his own father's voice, alive, aged, unmistakably real, speaking for the first time in 27 years, in a room full of witnesses instead of shadows. "Bianchi staged my death on your father's orders. I've spent almost 3 decades watching from a distance, waiting for the moment my son could inherit an organization free of the poison your family planted in it. Concetta Marchetti helped me disappear that night. She never betrayed anyone. She saved my life, and she's carried the proof of your father's crime in silence ever since, at the cost of her own peace." The room had gone utterly still. Every customer and neighbor who'd once whispered about the Castellano name now witness to a truth, 27 years buried. Rosie watched Dante absorb the sight of his father, alive, standing 20 feet away, and she understood, in that moment, exactly what it cost him to keep his voice steady when he finally spoke. "Why now?" Dante said. "Why wait until tonight, to show yourself completely?" "Because Vincent finally made a mistake big enough to expose everything," Salvatore said, nodding toward Rosie. "He touched an innocent woman to get what he wanted. That's not strategy, son. That's desperation. And desperate men make careless enemies." He turned to Vincent, whose gun hand had gone slack at his side, all his remaining options collapsing in the space of a single breath. "Your father built his empire on my blood and Concetta's silence. Today that debt comes due, in front of every witness this neighborhood has to offer." The police arrived within minutes, summoned by Tony, before Vincent had even finished his sentence, and Vincent Losco was taken out of the same bakery he'd once threatened to seize, in handcuffs, past a room full of people who had once feared his name and now simply watched him go, murmuring among themselves at everything they'd just witnessed. When the room slowly began to breathe again, murmurs turning to disbelief, and then, gradually, to something like relief, Dante found Rosie's hand and held it in front of everyone, no longer caring who saw, no longer weighing what it cost him to be known as a man who loved someone the way he loved her. "I spent my whole life believing power meant deciding who lives and who doesn't," he said, quiet enough that it was only for her, though half the room could still hear. "I'm done believing that's the only kind of power that matters. You taught me that, standing behind this counter, refusing to be afraid of anything my world threw at you." Salvatore watched his son find something his own generation had lost decades ago, and for the first time since the night his casket had been lowered into the ground under a lie, he allowed himself to hope that whatever came next for the Castellano name would finally be built on something other than fear. The wedding took place in the spring, 6 months after the day Vincent Losco had been led out of Nonna's table in handcuffs, held not in some grand cathedral befitting the Castellano name, but in the small courtyard behind the bakery, strung with lights and heavy with the smell of rising dough drifting out from the kitchen windows, exactly the way Rosie had insisted it should be. "Your grandmother would have wanted flour on the guest list somewhere," Angela had teased, helping Rosie into a dress that had belonged to Concetta herself, altered and restored with careful hands over the preceding months. And Rosie had laughed until she cried, because it was exactly true. Salvatore walked her down the short aisle between folding chairs crowded with neighborhood faces, and among them, near the back, sat the man in the gray suit who'd once slammed a foreclosure notice on her counter in front of a room full of witnesses, now hired legitimately by Dante to handle the bakery's expansion, standing to applaud with the rest. Mrs. Alvarez, who had once stood outside gossiping with the crowd that called her the Mafia girl, openly sobbed in the front row. Even a few of the old customers who'd stopped coming during the darkest weeks were there now, having quietly returned once the truth came out, offering awkward apologies Rosie had accepted without making them grovel for it, because holding a grudge had never been the kind of strength she wanted to build a marriage on. When Rosie reached Dante at the makeshift altar built from an old bakery display case draped in white linen, she found him looking at her, the way he'd never once looked at anyone, in 4 months of silent mornings, over coffee and ricotta pie, like she was the only certain thing in a world built on shifting loyalties and old debts. "You look terrified," she whispered, as the officiant began, and Dante's mouth twitched into that rare, real smile she'd come to treasure, more than any of his careful, controlled expressions. "I've faced down men with guns, without this much fear," he admitted quietly. "This feels considerably more dangerous." "Careful," she murmured, "or I'll start thinking you actually have a heart under all that quiet menace." "Only for you," he said, and it wasn't quiet menace in his voice at all, just simple, unguarded truth. The organization Dante inherited looked different by the time their first anniversary came around. Reshaped, under Salvatore's quiet guidance, and Dante's own hard-won conviction that loyalty built on fear crumbled the moment fear found a bigger target, while loyalty built on trust endured. Half the old guard who'd once profited from silence and threats found themselves eased out entirely, replaced by men who understood that Dante Castellano's word, once given, was worth more than any threat his predecessors had ever made. Nonna's table thrived beyond anything Rosie could have imagined the morning she'd stood behind her own counter and been told she owned nothing. The bakery expanded into the empty storefront next door, the one Vincent Losco's company had once threatened to seize, now transformed into a bright dining room where neighborhood families gathered every morning, where Salvatore held court most Sundays with an espresso, and stories about a young cook named Concetta, who'd once saved his life at the cost of her own peace. Stories he told anyone willing to listen, determined that her courage would never again be buried in silence. Camille Rossi's name surfaced once more, 18 months after her disappearance, in connection with an unrelated fraud case 3 states away, and Dante, reading the brief mention in the newspaper over his morning coffee, felt nothing but a distant, settled indifference, the kind that comes only when a person has truly moved past what once had power over them. It was on a quiet Tuesday morning, nearly 2 years after a stranger had slammed a folder on her counter and told a room full of witnesses she owned nothing, that Rosie found Dante sitting in his old booth by the window, newspaper folded beside his coffee, watching her work the counter with the same quiet focus he'd carried that very first morning, though everything about the man himself had changed entirely. "You know," she said, sliding a slice of ricotta pie across the counter to him, the same order he'd placed nearly every morning for 2 years running. "You could sit anywhere in this dining room now. We have actual booths that don't smell like burnt sugar." "I like this one," Dante said, and reached across the counter to rest his hand over the small, unmistakable curve just beginning to show beneath her apron, his eyes softening in a way that still, after everything, managed to steal her breath. "It's where I first realized the most important thing in my life wasn't power, or fear, or even the truth about my father. It was you, standing behind this counter, refusing to be afraid of a world that should have terrified you." "I was terrified," Rosie admitted, covering his hand with her own. "I just refused to let it stop me." "That," Dante said quietly, "is the only kind of power that ever mattered." Outside, Taylor Street moved through its ordinary Tuesday morning rhythm, delivery trucks and school buses, and neighbors greeting each other on sidewalks that had once whispered a woman's name in fear, and now simply called her Mrs. Castellano, with easy affection. And inside the bakery, her grandmother had built from nothing, surrounded by the smell of bread rising, and the quiet, steady presence of the man who'd once been nothing more than a silent stranger in the corner booth. Rosie Marchetti understood at last that love hadn't made either of them weaker. It had made them, both of them, finally, impossibly strong.